During the first week of this year, Islamist militants captured an army base in Borno, Nigeria, and reportedly massacred hundreds of civilians in nearby towns. These satellite images show the aftermath of the violence. It was part of a string of escalating attacks by Boko Haram, the same group that kidnapped more than 270 high school students last year. The group dates back to 2001, but became much more violent starting in 2009. In the past few years, the attacks have grown increasingly frequent and brutal, threatening to destabilize Africa's most populous country. Boko Haram wants to replace Nigeria's democratic government with an extremist theocracy. Still, because they operate out of the northeastern states, most of their victims have been the poorer Muslim communities that live there.
The biggest threat facing Pakistan today comes from within, from its lawless tribal territories on the western frontier, where the Taliban and Al-Qaeda were allowed to regroup and carry out attacks against U.S. troops across the border in Afghanistan, and now against the Pakistani government. During the past year, Islamic extremists have launched more than 600 terrorist attacks inside the country, killing more than 2,000 people. This suicide bombing last September at the Marriott Hotel in the capital of Islamabad killed 60 people, just minutes away from the presidential offices, now occupied by a very unlikely leader, Asif Ali Zardari.
On the one side, you had the Houthis, a political Shia rebel group, and people loyal to former President Saleh. On the other side, you had forces loyal to the new Hadi government. In 2014, Houthi forces took over Yemen's capital, Sana'a. Early the next year, the Houthis and Saleh loyalists tried to take control of the entire country, forcing Hadi to flee to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia considered the Houthi actions an immediate threat and feared this could be an opportunity for Iran to gain a foothold on their border. Saudi Arabia accuses Iran of backing the rebels, but Tehran denies any involvement. So Saudi Arabia started an alliance and began a military campaign. It's had a devastating impact, with more than 10,000 people killed since February 2014, and forcing more than 3 million people to flee their homes.
In March 2003, the United States, Britain, and a coalition of other countries invaded Iraq. Within a month, Baghdad was captured, Saddam Hussein was ousted, Iraq created a new government that was more democratic than Saddam's dictatorship, and then descended into sectarian chaos. After Baghdad fell, President Bush declared the end of major combat operations in Iraq, but troops soon found themselves trying to manage an increasingly organized insurgency that featured attacks and bombings. And by 2006, American intelligence analysts concluded that Iraq had become a haven for Islamist terrorists, which it hadn't been before the invasion. In fact, Saddam Hussein's socialist government, while it occasionally called upon religion to unify people against an enemy, was pretty secular. Although fewer than 200 Americans had died in the initial assaults, by the end of 2006, more than 3,000 American soldiers had been killed and another 20,000 wounded. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis had died in the conflict, and the costs of the war, which were promised to be no more than $60 billion, had ballooned to $200 billion.
In Syria, dictator Bashar al-Assad didn't think much of resigning and started a gruesome civil war against his own people. The longer the war went on, the more foreign groups joined the fight, most of them for religious reasons and with the goal of building an Islamic State in the region. And one of them was the infamous ISI, which now became the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. They had fought in Iraq for years and had thousands of well-trained and fanatic soldiers. They already quasi-controlled parts of northern Iraq and were very determined to build their religious state. And they changed the game in Syria like no one expected. ISIS was so unbelievably violent and radical that soon it was at war with almost every other faction of the Syrian rebel armies. They attacked and killed members of other Muslim terrorist groups. In the territories they controlled, they built an Islamic state with rules so strict that even the hardliners of Al-Qaeda and Saudi Arabia were shocked and withdrew their support.
The United States and its allies launched a military campaign in Afghanistan on October 7, 2001. Within a month, it appeared like the US was achieving its goal of removing the Taliban from power and destroying Al-Qaeda's safe havens. By November, the Taliban had already begun to retreat from large parts of the country.
I feel very happy because the Taliban troops went from Kabul.
People of Afghanistan don't like these people.
As a result, the UN Security Council passed a resolution that called on the UN to play a central role in peacekeeping and establishing a transitional government. And by the end of 2001, the Taliban had officially collapsed and a new interim government was installed. But in 2002, that momentum began to slow down. Some say partly because the United States became distracted, shifting its intelligence and military resources away from Afghanistan and onto its new military campaign in Iraq.
Since 2003, at least 300,000 Darfuris have been killed, but millions more were forced out of their villages and into camps like this one. The government historically denied most basic services, so people here rely only on each other. This clothing drive was organized for victims of an attack carried out just 10 days before we arrived.
أنينا كان خريب تردانا وأنينا نازحين وأهلنا طردوهم من معسكراته وحرقوهم وقتلوهم عشان كده قلنا أنينا كان نازحين نعمل لجنة عشان نلمنا ونساعدوا أهلنا بخارج.
Have any of you tried to go back to your land in the years that you've been living here?
الهجمات والقتل في البلد لسه لا زال مستمر.
After 6 years of fighting, South Sudan's civil war is coming to an end. To ensure peace, the government forced more than 50,000 police officers, soldiers, and rebels into camps to become its new unified peacekeeping force. Deployed across the country to handle everything from fighting fires to guarding the president. A little more than a year ago, most people here were trying to kill each other. But today, they're celebrating the opening of this camp.
Today, the Syrian war enters its 10th year. This war has destroyed some of the oldest cities in the world, killed more people than we'll ever know, and scattered 2/3 of its population in search of refuge. And it isn't over. So what's going on in Syria? The war began as an internal affair, pro-democracy protests that escalated after a brutal government crackdown. But the story today is far more complicated. It's a proxy battleground for foreign powers, a site of religious and ethnic conflict, as well as a civil war. So to sum up, Assad and his allies fight rebels in the northwest. The Kurds were fighting IS further east, but now are overrun with Turkish forces. And down south, Israel launches its own attacks.